and welcome to this introduction to PanShaper, the ultimate panning plugin from Cableguys. With its rich and intuitive interface, PanShaper makes it easy to dial in simple or complex panning patterns to add extra stereo movement and interest to your parts, and clearly shows how your patterns relate to the audio you're processing. Patterns can be BPM synced or time-based, can be gentle curves or rhythmic steps, can be locked to your host or triggered via MIDI. And you can even enable a crossover section to set up different panning patterns for up to 3 different frequency bands, and manipulate stereo width independently for each band. Let's start with a new preset, processing a guitar part. The incoming audio waveform is displayed on the graph to the left of the interface, running from top to bottom. And if I click on the graph, I can add points and drag them around to create gentle curves. And sure enough, the guitar part now pans from left to right accordingly. Double-clicking a point will delete it, while right-clicking will change the curve shape, toggling through a smaller curve with a sharper edge, and no curve at all, and then back to a gentle curve again. If I right-click the background of the graph, I can select all points at once and drag them around together, or stretch them around in various ways by dragging the nodes on the surrounding box. Alternatively, hold the Shift key to lasso a smaller selection of points and manipulate only those. The pattern I've dialed in currently loops every bar. This can be changed in the LFO section to the right. If I set a longer loop length, such as 2 bars, the pattern now loops at half the speed, and the waveform display in the background updates every 2 bars instead of every bar. Obviously, the length of a bar depends on your project tempo, so with a tempo synced setting like this, the actual modulation rate will depend on the tempo of your song. If you prefer, you can specify a constant modulation rate in Hertz, and this time the modulation speed won't change if you change the project tempo. However, this setting and the one above are both synced to the host DAW song position, meaning that the panning will always happen in the same place, even if you start playback from halfway through the song or halfway through a measure. By contrast, the retrigger settings below will loop constantly regardless of the host playback position, more like a traditional LFO, but can be retriggered via MIDI notes if you route MIDI data to the plugin. Note that the beat retrigger mode still alters the modulation speed to match the project tempo. So if you reset it with a MIDI note at a bar start, it will then run in sync with the project. Down at the bottom, we find a pair of one-shot modes. These don't do anything at all until the plug receives a MIDI note, at which point the modulation is triggered once, more like an envelope than an LFO. And these 2 modes are great for spot effects that only happen in certain parts of the song. We also have a special MIDI triggered mode. Pitch to rate runs the modulation at the frequency defined by the last MIDI note received, so you can play the modulation at audio rates to create interesting stereo amplitude modulation effects. Okay, let's switch to a different example. Here we have a preset from Cableguys Curve 2 synth, combining percussive elements with a rhythmic pedal bassline with lots of glide. I'll set the LFO to cycle over 2 bars to match the preset pattern. And this time I'm going to switch to steps drawing mode, so I can quickly and easily dial in hard-edged step sequencer style patterns. If I right-click the background, I can switch to triplet timing instead. Let's take a look at the crossover section at the top right. If I click the button in the top corner, I can show a larger spectrum view. And I can solo the selected band with the S button next to it, which doesn't make any difference at the moment as we're running a single full-range band. So let's drag the left-hand crossover up higher to exclude the sub-bass region and keep that centered. And drag the right-hand crossover down to exclude the high frequencies above about 2 or 3 kHz. Both crossovers default to a gentle and transparent 6 dB per octave slope. but we can switch these to more surgical 12 dB per octave filters instead. Let's click the high band to solo that instead, and close the large spectrum view so we can dial in some panning for the hi-hats. A range of preset modulation shapes are available to the right of the waveform editor, grouped into categories such as basic, with simple sine or square type waves available, or edge, with a range of hard-edged step sequencer style patterns, while the rhythm and creative categories provide more complex patterns, which you can then tweak manually if required. If you're feeling lucky, you can try randomizing points. This sets new random values for all points, but doesn't add any extra points, so you'll get different results with a simpler starting point. Your customized waveform can be saved into one of the 6 user slots below. Let's switch to the mid-band again, and save the pattern. Then switch back to the high band and load it again. If I now right-click and flip channels, I've created equal and opposite panning for the mid and high bands. Let's turn off solo to hear all bands together. The high-frequency panning is now represented by the yellow waveform, while the other 2 bands are shown in the background in orange and green. And I can shift the wave up and down using the triangle symbols to the right to move it forward or back in time. If you make a mess and want to backtrack, a pair of undo and redo buttons are provided below. I'd like the high-frequency panning to be a little more subtle, actually. I could dial it back with the mix knob in the master section, but this is a global control and will affect the other bands as well. So instead, I'll select all points for the high frequencies and drag the boundaries of the box inwards to narrow the panning. The master section also provides a choice of pan laws, which determine the relative volume of hard panned signals. The balance 0 setting doesn't apply any panning law at all, so hard pan signals will tend to sound quieter than centered signals coming from both channels. Conversely, the balance 6 dB setting will boost hard pan signals by 6 dB, which may make them seem louder than centrally panned signals. The 3 dB or 4.5 dB settings in between are probably the most useful, and with most material these will be best at maintaining the same apparent volume as the signal pans from left to centre to right. Note that PanShaper boosts hard panned signals rather than attenuating centrally panned signals, as is the usual implementation for mixer channel pan pots, and this avoids any initial volume drop when inserting the plug on a channel. PanShaper is also happy to process signals that are already stereo, such as this rhythmic pad type sound, again from Curve 2. In this case, we're technically modulating the balance between the channels rather than the panning, unless I switch to the stereo combined mode, which will pan the right channel over to the left and vice versa. The crossover section also provides a set of stereo controls for each band. If you would prefer to mono the signal before applying any panning, you can switch the input to just the left or right channel. Or you can turn the input width all the way down to work with a mono down mix of left and right. We also have a stereo width control for the output, so I could turn this up to make the panning more extreme. Hard pan signals are now also added to the opposite channel with reverse phase, making them appear to extend beyond the limits of the stereo field. Of course, it's usually a good idea to check the mix in mono when applying this sort of widening, as too much may make the part tend to disappear in the mono version. Okay, I'll now turn up the low crossover frequency again, so we get a different panning pattern for the low frequencies. It's commonly known that we can't hear stereo content for low sub-bass frequencies below about 80 Hz. However, the cutoff at which we start to perceive stereo placement is surprisingly steep and sudden, and we're actually very sensitive to stereo information above about 100 Hz. I'll set the crossover point a little higher than that, keeping the gentle default 6 dB slope. And I'll widen the low frequency input signal to make the pad sound bigger and wider at the low end. We can also use the width controls on their own without applying any panning at all. Here's an instance over the full mix, with low sub-bass frequencies down-mixed to mono, while the low mid-range is gently widened, using the gentle and transparent 6 dB per octave slopes for both. As I'm not applying any panning in this case, it doesn't matter whether I adjust the input or output width controls, as they'll have the same effect. Settings can be saved as presets via the menu at the top right, and will then appear in the Preset Browser tab. Here we have the option to share those presets with the rest of the online community. If I now sync the preset database, my shared presets will be uploaded and shared presets from other users will be downloaded, and these can all be searched using keywords. Even if you choose not to share your presets, they can still be backed up to your user account. So syncing will restore all your presets after a reinstall or a move to a different computer. This is all optional, however. PanShaper comes ready with a selection of useful factory presets and will work just fine without any internet connection. That's all I have time for in this video. If you need more information, you can hover over each control on the interface to show a scrolling description of that parameter below. Thanks for watching.